G'day and welcome to another episode of Inforunners. I'm Algared. Joining me today are both Execute and Haze, and we're going to be talking about ground combat, where we've been, where it started, where we're going, what we think it's going to have in it, and also what the A2 or what the Hercules really tells us is coming. To start us off, Haze.
Okay, so starting at the very beginning, I suppose ground combat, the whole idea of like FPS combat was starting with pirates boarding your ship and sort of like being able to fight them off. And perhaps even like the idea of bounty hunting. These were the most simplest of combat. And then I guess it sort of expanded in the idea of visiting like a city and being able to explore that location a little bit. But at the end of the day, it was incredibly limited, very select locations only, sort of a situation. And then
it really was just skirmish battles, wasn't it? Just small little groups.
More like landing zones in other games. So I think of things like KOTOR and stuff like that, where you go to a kind of a special area to participate in it, and there would be those rare instances where you kind of go onto someone else's ship and there's you're trying to board them. That would be probably the most common scenario back in the day, but now it's expanded quite significantly.
Well, even originally, those landing zone things were all we were going to have. We were only going to have 3 or 4 landing zones per planet. But then, as Haze was about to say, we got pupil to planet.
Yeah, planet
so,
tech
that's back to you.
Changed the kind of the game. You want to talk about that, Execute?
Pupil to planet. I guess when I first saw it, I thought it was incredibly early when it came along. I was expecting that type of technology to be a lot further along. And I do find it really kind of interesting because they've really alliterated on it quite a bit since we first saw it. And even in the latest ATV, there was more alliterations again. We saw forests this week. And I actually think, like, when I first thought about it, I always wondered if it was going to be this gimmick. But now I think it's really gonna add to the game quite substantially, and I'm kind of interested to see how far it goes, and not just in ground combat, but that's probably something more for another time. But my monitor just flicked on and off. That was really weird. But yeah, I don't know what to say.
Yeah, well, I think that pupil to planet, like you said, it blew me away. I was like, wow, it really was a game changer, and I think it even got Chris Roberts kind of excited as well. Like, he'd always been, it'd be nice if we could do that, but I don't even think he imagined the tech was there. And I can remember him saying that a German said, "Hey, look what we can do," and I was like, "Wow!"
I actually remember Lando talking about Chris giving him the footage, and he just turned to Chris and said, "Oh, we're there already," and Chris just got this big smile on his face. So yeah, I remember that distinctively. Yeah, but I guess the other part we kind of need to talk about too is like how this has kind of progressed. After that, we kind of obviously had vehicles start to come into the foray, and I guess the first one there was the Cyclone, and you had the basics of the turret module, but it was the one that really kind of shows the combat perspective is the AA variant. And I remember at the time you were saying earlier, Haze, that we weren't sure how it was going to kind of work with the ships, and like, would it even be able to take a ship out? And I remember when we did the episode, what other things were going to need to be there for this to be a viable vehicle.
And I think, like, just from doing flying around the valleys in ships, one thing that the EMP ships showed was those EMP missiles, if they knock out the engines, your ship will crash. You will go down. So that answered that question. Will they be able to take out a ship? Yeah.
I also mean a bit more like defensive structures, like some of the things we're potentially looking at now. I might be getting a bit of my head of myself here. Is defensive structures like shields and stuff. It's not just going to be a one vehicle scenario. It's much akin as World War II was. There was your main attackers, your troops. You've got your vehicles. You've got your support. It's a team effort. There's no one all vehicle, which is kind of interesting because everyone wants that one all vehicle in the game. but there is no one-all vehicle or ship for that matter.
And then to go on with what you're saying, yeah, we do get those structures, and the Pioneer was the first thing that came along and showed us that is coming. The Pioneer will
really
build those
interesting.
structures.
It gives you both something to defend as well as something to attack that's sort of player-based, as opposed to before we had sort of an instanced combat that was generated, and you had to go there to do the combat. Now you can bring your own situation, your own bases, and bring the combat to them or other people to you. At the end of the day, it has a two-sided equation of a system. We now have to do balance and checks to make it sort of fair or a fight. And this was the very first step that Pioneer gave us the objectives and sort of even promised us space defenses like, turrets and other defensive structures.
Slightly off tangent here, I actually think because of how big the Pioneer's step, I'm actually suspecting there are going to be other building vehicles or ships along the way. It just seems such a big thing to put on the back of one ship. I don't know, that's just my 2 cents.
Well, I think we've hinted at the idea of maybe having ships that can just drop off prefab buildings already. They don't have to construct them on site. There's clearly, from the idea of the lore, there's clearly some other really bigger ship or really specialized ships that do this, because the Pioneer is enabling everyone to do it cheaply.
Yep.
So there's other stuff that's out there that's doing it. It's just that we don't see them yet.
I don't remember the Pioneer being cheap.
No, well,
in what do you call it? In the scheme of things, yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
But yeah, and you've got the Pioneer that can do that, and we were told that we'll have turrets that we can add, and defenses we can add, and power plants and shields.
Sorry, I'm picturing, just because of what Haze said, I'm picturing this little 3D printer ship that now comes along, and like you dump a little thing, and it like 3D prints you a little house, and then you. And it goes off and does the next one. Sorry, I just thought it's just weird in my head.
Those things get us all time, But so we've got the Pioneer, and then if that wasn't enough to let us know ground combat was going to be huge, we got the Tonk.
Yeah.
Well, the Nova tank is actually really important. It was the first vehicle we ever had that said, we're not just going to do a limited scale warfare and just do combat as a small skirmish. They literally said, armored warfare, large battles, this thing has to have a purpose. And, at the end of the day, this was the guarantee that we're taking ground combat seriously as perhaps what we're doing in the ship battles.
The other one that I think of too, I guess I'm kind of hoping here, is I want to see other vehicles, because this is a future scenario. And I think the other one that we've probably just skipped there that I think about it now is we didn't mention Titan suits. Titan suits kind of came along a little bit before the tank, but they were never really hinted as a ground thing, I guess.
No,
but now you can tuck that into there, can't you?
Yeah. But before they were kind of seen as an everything, a utility, an attack vehicle, everything that you could think of, they kind of filled in the role. But,
I think Titan suits came out before, like they were talking about Titan suits long before we were sure ground combat was really going to be a thing. But the funny thing is, they're sort of best suited for ground combat as opposed to working in spaceships and stations anyway. So,
as I said, additive. And after the Tonk came out in January, I remember we did an episode when there was some new concept images of the Titan suits, and they were on surface and on planet. So I think that's more additive proof to the fact that this is where they're leaning with this. They're making ground combat a big thing, and as we said earlier, it's changing the nature of the game from this space game to something more like PlanetSide-esque, where it's we've seen in the past where it's like 4 games in one. Now it's like 5 games in one. Like it's just added another whole thing. And
I think the Planet Tech really is the thing that drove it.
Yeah,
we went from those small landing zones to 2 or 3 landing zones that were planet to the whole moon, to the whole planet, and that meant it's got to be filled with stuff. And so, how are we going to fill it? Well, we can do ground combats. Well, let's flesh that out more. And so, that Planet Tech is really driving this. I think this whole move towards or fleshing out of ground combat to be more dynamic and more and bigger than it was, I imagine, intended to be.
I think that's a positive thing, though, in a lot of ways when I think about it, because a lot of these games that do have that procedural stuff, they how do I put it? They lack content. They lack like it's
limited replayability. It gets
it gets kind of repetitive, and oh cool, I can fly over this procedurally generated jungle that looks the same as all the others. It's just laid out differently, but I can't really do anything in there. This is going to allow you to do
sandbox
stuff
where you can set up all the variables from start to finish.
Yeah.
That literally the sky's the limit because you're on the ground. Sorry, pun. But let's step on to today, the big one. The Crusader Hercules. This is the biggest sort of flag that what ground combat is going to be. Like the Nova Tank was the huge wake up call. The A2 is like the mallet to the head. It literally wakes you up here because sure, the C2 and the M2, being able to actually reposition a Nova Tank and use it as an assault on any location. That is one thing, but the real game changer here for ground combat is the bomber.
I actually think it's slightly, you can, if you want to go zoom in even more, it is the bombs specifically, and even more specifically is the fact that they're gravity bombs, as in they rely on gravity to drop. Because if you drop that in space, it ain't dropping out of your, like it's going to blow you up. It's not going to just drop out of your ship.
You're not
going to
drop a Moab bomb on a Nova Tank. It's obviously designed for something much bigger.
Yeah, and it's not even for bombing an outpost. It's clearly the bomb out. The motherboard bombs is to knock out a fortified structure with heavy shielding.
I meant the difference between in space and in atmosphere when I said gravity. Sorry. It's a very large bomb, and we also know they've got other bombs. Like you can look at some of the images, and they have all these little bombs laid out in front of the Hercules. So you can have carpet bombing, standard bombing, and these massive Moab bombs. So it's not just a one-trick pony, kind of like the Retaliator that just shoots torpedoes. It's got a variety of these things, and where the A2 has the Moab, the other variants can still have bombs too, just not to the same
ability.
Capacity?
Yeah, absolutely. But the thing with the Moab bomb is I can totally see that. Like, you have a ground force, they're coming into attack, they're attacking a heavily shielded and defended, fortified position, and the guys can't even put a scratch on it unless you take your Moab bomb and literally drop it on the shield generator. And then they go like, the shields are down, go. It's like, at the end of the day, you get you gave me an example before in Star Wars where, they're talking to Darth Vader, it says, Darth Vader, the shields are down, he says.
Yeah, you may, what is it? You may start your descent. The shields will be down momentarily, or something like that. And he's targeting the shield generator in one of the AT-ATs. Yeah, so I think it's going to be a little bit, not like you can definitely do it that way. Like you can either drain the shields and then attack on foot, or even attack on foot and then get the shields down so the air support can come in. It's going to be, you can have multiple choices on how you're going to be able to approach this, which I think
I could even see another bomb coming along, which will be the laser guided. The guys on the ground light it up, and then the bomber comes in and drops it,
Yeah, in a multiplayer game like this, the more connections you can have between things, the stronger that's going to be. So, whether it's laser targeting or even, things like dropship as well, like, maybe dropping a dropship that drops Titan suits or drops a bunker or drops medical supplies, and if they go straight into the hot zone is another thing. So, like, if you could literally, as a part of the combat, if you get a Titan suit that lands on you, there's a connection from sky to ground very, very quickly.
As it grinds you into the dust.
No, I don't think there'll be any grinding. It'll just be a confetti.
Splat. Yeah.
But I was actually just thinking, like, even though we're saying the A2 is the thing that nailed it on the head, way back when they were talking the Gladiator, if you look at the Gladiator lore and everything that the Gladiator does, it was used for
bombing missions
on planets and supply relief on planets and all of those things. And so even back then, we had these hints that ground combat, was ideally going to be something big, but now it's not just big; it is huge.
I think back then it was
I've got to ask a question. Sorry.
Now it's starting to turn into this reality.
do you guys think we might now actually see some gravity-fed bombs that can go into standard ships? Such as the Gladiator.
Yeah, well,
The Gladiator,
the Gladiator was supposed to do that. That was one of the things it did in law. And I imagine those small bombs.
Retaliator is perfectly suited for atmospheric bombing.
Could you technically take a torpedo and turn off the guidance systems and just let it drop? Does that mean we could even see a Retaliator use its torpedoes as a gravity-fed bomb?
I think it's much more expensive to buy a torpedo than a bomb.
Yeah, but like in a pinch, if you've already got torpedoes loaded, can you use them as ground bombs just by like turning off the smart part of the bomb and it just drops?
Well, I think the difference is we think of torpedoes as being, things that go in water and they're only one thing. But really, the difference is missiles and torpedoes. And torpedoes are just huge missiles.
Yeah, cruise missiles.
So if you've got a target, I can fire my missile at that target.
Well, Retaliator has those giant VTOLs on it as well, much like the Hercules does. So there's no question there where it couldn't do a similar type of role, but where it's cargo combat, it's more stealthy, troop-focused stealthiness. I don't know, special forces to their normal Marines.
Retaliator does have the option of bringing in ground troops. It does have the option of using its torpedoes. I imagine the Retaliator and the Gladiator could very easily equip those smaller bombs.
So that might be the next step, is the expanding of roles of older ships.
I think it's just that, unless it's going through a torpedo tube, like I don't think a Polaris can take bombs.
No, I don't think a Polaris can, but I specifically mentioned the Retaliator because it's got those drop-style doors, and it's got those massive VTOL on it.
And it's also got the ground combat,
and there'll be ships modules that can do both, and there's ships that will be specialists, like the A2 and the Polaris. They are very specialist in their role.
I'm kind of challenging that role. I actually, knowing what CIG's been doing recently, is this them kind of holding back a bit of information so people buy more A2s when then they're going to turn around and say, oh yeah, by the way, a Retaliator can take normal bombs as well, or
a large part of a missile is not the ordnance. It is the actual fuel, it is the rocket, it is the systems. At the end of the day, you can have like 4 times as much ordnance if it's gravity assisted. So at the end of the day, it's a simple trade-off. 1, it should be cheaper, and 2, you can bring twice to 4 times as much, actual firepower with you.
Well, it's again with the Retaliator having modules. There's no reason they can't make a Moab variant of the Retaliator. It's just a switching of the how the torpedoes spin around to just one big one, and it drops out the door. And that's very easy to do.
And I could see the advantage if you're looking at bomb or missile. The advantage of a missile is that, yes, it's taking less of a payload, but it's able to be fired from further away. Advantage for defenders, more chance to knock it out.
I think going off from the whole bombing, because we're sort of overdoing it here. The whole idea of this, though, is that the A2 is introducing larger armored warfare, larger faction versus faction, as opposed to doing like small skirmishes. We're now going to expect battles that are going to be on the scale of fleet battles, because at the end of the day, in order to have several tanks in play, in order to have something as large as an A2 to sort of need that to happen, you need to have large scale battles. And so this is where we start to see planet side level of combat, where and we might even start to see where planet side, where we have ground combat, air combat, and space combat being combined in a battle that is waged on all 3 fronts. So in other words, you'd be wiping out and gaining access to the airspace in space, which then would allow you to enter your ships into atmosphere, which would then deploy the ground troops, which then finally be able to take your objective. And if you fail in any one of those fronts, you've lost the war, but you have to win all the battles in that progression.
It's another step in the link of the chain, I guess, between, like previously the obvious one would be the taking of a space station, but now if you're taking some kind of ground installation, it can add, you've got that additive part where you might have to go on foot between vehicle to get to the final destination, and then also on the way back you've got another way to come back as well. We also know that from I don't know if you guys remember the Constellation video at the, I think it was CitizenCon that year, where they you couldn't land near where the javelin was because there was something stopping it. It might be the same thing. There might be some kind of jamming thing that you can put in so it forces the enemy to use ground troops to attack your installation.
Yep, I had forgotten that. But yeah, you're right. You know, that's something that's stopping you be able to land. Magnetic storm, magnetic interference.
Well, you know,
will
they could have
cause you to have to land elsewhere and move in by foot.
They could actually control the skies in the atmosphere, but not in space. And so, like, in order for you to get your landing ships, you need to be able to bring a sizable force to deal with them while you get your landing parties down. It's like, you know, there should be several steps. I mean, you can't bring large capital ships in the atmosphere. Let's say.
I was just going to say. Sorry, you go.
No, I said what I want.
I was just going to add that people may even pick their base locations based on these anomalies. It's something that I never really considered until I just kind of went back over it there.
When you think about mountains and oceans, to stop people being able to attack it from several sides, so they're forced into a funnel of, you know, defensive.
Yeah, and almost like natural terrain that was used in many warfares on Earth. It'll be the same thing, but you'll be using natural anomalies. And even if you take it back to simple space combat, you're going to see that with nebulas as well. A planet that's in a nebula.
Yeah, we're putting bases in asteroid fields.
Well, and I can see ships with the ability to take Nova tanks or want bombing runs. I can see it being employed by the combatants on Sharon 3. We know in lore that this planet's in a civil war. They're not a member state, but they're...
Speaking of that, I think we're going to see combat-focused groups who specialize just in armored warfare, specialize in doing these sort of things. And so you might have some jobs who are doing the battle in space, and then they get dropped off, and then suddenly it's their turn to shine, because they're the best at what they do there. And I can see people focusing on this armored warfare, and you know that's all they do.
Yeah, your battlefield gamers and your planet-side gamers that like those games, but they get the added benefit of having other gamers that are included in their universe, and if they do want to take a break, they can do a bit of ship combat or a bit of trading or something like that. It's a game that's more all-encompassing because it is, like I said earlier, you know, 4 or 5 games in one.
Yeah, well, that lore post I sent you earlier, Execute, talked about how a general was escaping from Dillon, and the Arcaran militia tried to stop them and basically got destroyed or were routed. And that caused an emergency session of the UEE Senate to talk about this heightened combat. And so we've got a civil war on our doorstep. But we don't only have a civil war with humans fighting each other. We've got Vandal on Orion and Caliban, and even on that PE front, we've got ground combat in droves.
Yeah, and that obviously leads into, we know they're big into their blades and stuff like that, but also, and I don't mean blade the ship, I mean like knives. But are we also going to see Vulcan ground vehicles and more Banu ground vehicles and Tavaran and Xian, and it goes on?
I sure hope so. Yeah, you know, I absolutely love that. Speaking of ground combat, I bet they're going to have to fight off against a Vandal sometime. I imagine that'd be rather scary.
Yeah.
You know?
And another thing just to add with the Tavaran there, it's obviously expanded what other drop ships can do. So ships like the Hoplite and the Redeemer and also the Prowler have all kind of now got another kind of role thing that's just popped in there, you know.
Absolutely. The A2 is only the tip of the iceberg. There's going to be a lot more ground combat based ships and vehicles. Even structure is going to be introduced from here on out. In fact, when we think about it, CIG have said there are no more combat ships for the rest of the year. That doesn't mean they can't bring in combat ground vehicles.
Yeah, I noticed if you look at the ship matrix, the vehicles are not called ships.
That's right. They've cleverly tricked us there, and you know they can still hold their promise. So just bend a few rules. So let's think about let's move on to speculation now. Let's think about what's the future going to hold moving forward with regards to like ground combat. Like
it's going to be huge.
Do you think we'll see huge like structures, or you know?
It's all possible.
What sort are we going to see?
We could, as I said earlier about when I was talking about the Pioneer, we could see a ship that's literally just based around fortifications. It adds armor to buildings, or it builds bunkers. Or
we know from the Pioneer that it can't build multi-story buildings yet, and that's not part of its plan. The plan is that it builds outposts. As we build outposts, that will bring on other buildings. And so whether we'll have flak towers like Germany had in World War II in Berlin.
I definitely think we're going to see AA.
Mobile AA that works much like cargo. You can just slap it in the back of your ship, but then little things like, can you haul it around with a cyclone and position it where you need it to be? Same thing with shield generators. Both offensive and defensive structures.
We know the Nova tanks are going to have different turrets as well.
Yes.
So anti-air and anti-tank and
artillery even. Long-range artillery, both in missiles and kind of like your, what do you call it? HE and armor piercing and all that type of thing. So,
the different ammo types, for the shells.
So that's going to change combat as well. And that's another hint that ground combat is going to be big.
A big thing in development is to use the rock, paper, scissor analogy, and you'll see it again and again because it works really well. Because even if you come up against the same thing that you're in, so you come up against an over tank and he's got HE and you've got armor piercing.
Well, I think anything that we saw in World War II, I imagine they might do an equivalent for. From trenches, defensive structures, mines. All these things are. If you want to fortify a base, these are like the bread and butter.
I'd like to see a little twist on that though. So instead of being really going over what we already know, I'd like to see them add little other things. So instead of just another tank, what if it's a mech, or what if it's a tank that walks, or and then obviously we've even got water coming in. Are we going to see versions of submarines or tanks that can be like a boat that goes on ground, or what do they call that?
Hover vehicles, like a hover tank.
What do they call it when a vehicle can go on water? Amphibious.
Oh, you're talking about
amphibious.
Yeah,
that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, like hovercraft.
So like a troop transporter, like an APC that can
as long as they're not the waterproof tanks that they had at the landings at Normandy.
Yeah, didn't they sink?
Most of them did. Most of them are still at the bottom of the ocean.
My granddad went and assaulted that in one of those, and they literally had to climb over the sides, and then they drowned because the equipment was too heavy.
Oh God!
No, that's a landing.
He didn't
craft.
drown, but
I thought that was what you were saying. I was like, by the way, my granddad drowned.
That's the landing craft though, where the troops were bailing out the side. But at Normandy, they even had their tanks, and they put webbing around the side to make them waterproof. And the tanks actually tried riding into the coast as well. And most of the tanks that went in actually sunk. They were actually swamped.
It's a very human thing to
at the bottom of the ocean.
Sorry. It's a very human thing to use what we know, and using World War II as a reference, you can very clearly see they've borrowed from it fairly heavily already. Little things like the U-boat, I can see those as the drop ships, and you've just got to kind of scale it through time, and you can see everything from that they had like mine layers and stuff like that. They'll come into play. They even things that were at the end of the war, like they had mini little tanks that were robotic that had explosives in them. So drones. You might see drones that are combat variants that literally are like suicide drones that just fly into a bunker and detonate.
You mean like the dogs with the explosive attached to them? And
no, they. I'll let you look it up later. But there's actually these little mini robotic tanks that drove themselves, and they detected metal and stuff, and they just drove up to it and detonated. So they would leave them in fields and stuff, and if the tank came nearby, it would drive to it and detonate.
Speaking of drones, since we're on this, a great segue. I totally imagine like we're going to see atmospheric specialties, but like recon drones, remotely controlled recon drones that fly over the battlefield,
like predators.
Not worth
today.
shooting down. Yeah, well, not with weapons, but just for like purely for recon.
Yeah. Okay.
Or like manned like light aircraft. It's incredibly fast and incredibly light. You can go long distances.
Is the Drake version just a hang glider? Like it just.
Yeah, well, they have those too. They've already shown us hang gliders with the 600.
Yeah, but were they Drake?
Yeah,
Were they
I'm
Drake?
just, I don't know, I'm spitballing here. I'm saying a cheap man's drone is a Drake hang glider. Can't afford the robotics, so just send a man, But
Yep. So I'm going to stop our speculation there, guys, and I'm going to ask you, what do you think it means? In the long run, where does this take us? What
More
predictions have you got?
organized team combat, like large scale team combat. Like it's going to be groups like an armor who are literally very organized, moving together with finesse, as opposed to I can't see this being the next Battlefield. It's far too complex, and people have investment in these materials and these bases and these tanks and these ships. At the end of the day, you have so much more to lose. It can't be just a quick FPS gunning. It has to.
Sorry, when I mention Battlefield, I mean those battles, but obviously it's more like assaulting a castle type scenario. You build your own castle and sandcastle, and someone else is trying to knock it down. But when I say Battlefield, there are going to be those skirmishes that is just a run-in. But I think the end part, what you're saying, the end kind of, it's going to be this huge faction trying to say someone's taken an industrial node. They've mentioned player-owned space stations and stuff. Why can't they put those player-owned space stations on the ground, and it's a facility, and now all of a sudden you're attacking their facility to take their resources so you can control of it.
I totally think they will, but it will be on not an org versus org type thing. It'll be a faction versus faction. Just like.
And if you remember, like when we talked about space, being able to control space stations, that was back in the day before we had the planet tech come in, and so that's just double the number of spaces we can control.
Yes,
I think we clearly can tell as the game progresses, more and more things are going to be added, and you can connect the dots between what they've already had and what is going to add to it. And I can just see little parts of all these little things coming together and making it, as you said earlier, a very complex game that is going to be really well thought out and very deep. And I think that's what a lot of people are looking for these days. Like, my initial attraction to this game was the 4-player in a constellation type concept, but now I can still do that, but I can be a faction or I can be in an org
fighting for a bigger cause.
Yeah, and we might be the mercenaries, why another org is actually doing the mining and stuff, but we protect them because they pay us, and it all works around. And I can see the whole thing like a bunch of cogs clicking together, making this huge, massive.
It is very multi-layered, because if you have to.
No, go on.
If you have to win the space battle just so that you can get to the air battle, just so that you can then try and win the ground battle at the end of the day, it gives you that multi-layered thing where you might have to keep air superiority and a space superiority over that in order to continue to resupply your ground forces until they take their objective. That is incredibly easy, because you could fail in one of those steps and it could fail the whole thing.
Yeah, like for me, it really hits home the idea of what Operation Pitchfork was all about. Operation Pitchfork had pitched the idea of, let's retake Orion, let's kick the Vandal out, let's push them back. But this says it's not just going to be a fleet battle. No. Operation Pitchfork, I'm sorry guys, it's going to be nasty. We can't just take them out from the sky. We're going to have to go down on the ground, and we're going to have to fight hand to hand with the Vandal. It's going to be bloody, it's going to be nasty, it's going to be dirty.
It gets dirty in those trenches. I mean, at the end of the day, move aside Operation Pitchfork. That's not the real challenge. The challenge is going to be Operation Cleanse Caliban. Yep,
Cleanse Caliban. Let's purge the Vandal out of the system, not just from the air, but from the planet itself. That's and that to me is going to be huge. It just says this game is epic and will be epic. So yeah. Closing comments?
Well, wrapping it up, what we can definitely say now is CIG have now committed to full-scale, large, armored ground combat. And that has changed the nature of the game, or what Star Citizen is going to be forever. Because it used to be compared as to games like Elite Dangerous. It was thought and said as this is the best damn space sim ever, and it is no longer the best damn space sim. It's closer to a mix of a planet-side multiplayer combat system and an expansive space simulator, which is great.
Yeah, I think that really does speak volumes. It's no longer just the best space sim ever; it will be the best universe ever, and I just think it's something to look forward to. It's going to be as game changing as Wing Commander was back in the day.
Yep.
It's going to make a lot of developers and studios open their eyes when it finally does get into release, and they'll say, how can we even attempt to try to match this? You know, this is the new standard.
Publishers are going to struggle with
the concept
because they're going to realize they're going to have to take a really deep dive to get to duplicate it, and I think because it's publisher free, it's going to take.
Most publishers won't do that. They just can't. They're
not prepared to risk money. They like proven money,
and this is where the real money is for CAG.
Innovation is a big thing. And let's be honest, if you really look at a lot of games, other than graphics, there really has not been a terrible amount of innovation. I know back when I did it, they would take a concept like, say, Half-Life, and they'll go, "Hey, let's add a grappling hook."
You look at MMOs, you know, Lotro, Warcraft, Conan. You go in, you mine the minerals, you make the craft, you go fight. They're exactly the same dynamic, exactly the same technique. It's just the graphics are different.
But you see, EA doesn't have to make their own system. At the end of the day, CIG can sell them the tech and license it. And that's where the real money probably is going to be. This is going to be like the money they make in the PU is going to be minor, but the money they make licensing the tech to other companies, that might be where the real payday.
Yeah.
Okay. And on that note, I was Algared.
I'm Execute.
And this was Haze. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you have any comments, put them down below. We read all the comments. We try to reply to as many as we can.
I just want
we
to
now
add.
have a Discord.
I just want to add. Oh, you do the Discord, then I want to say something.
Okay, we now have a Discord. It's the best place to get in contact with us. And if you have any show ideas, we're always open to taking out people's thoughts.
Don't forget that they've got a competition on at the moment that you can write a short story to win a Hercules, so check that out on the RSI forums in Spectrum. Also, The Expanse has been cancelled. There's a submission on at the moment if you go onto the subreddit. They are asking for people to contact Netflix and see if it can get picked up, much like some other shows. So, yeah, it's a fantastic show. Highly recommended if you're a fan of Star Citizen. And, yeah, get onto Netflix and see if we can get them to pick it up, because it is an utterly fantastic show. So, yeah, that's all I wanted to add, because I'm a big fan of that.
Yes.
The Expanse.
It's definitely a show for anyone who likes sci-fi. Just Star
favorite.
Citizen, but yes.
Favorite.
Anyway.
Thanks, guys. Check you next time.
Take care.
Catch you around.